nonetheless want to watch this session later. So, as I said, my name is Sue McKenna. I am the lead of the Enabling Quality Postgraduate Education project, which is funded by the Department of Higher Education and Training. And with us, we have our colleague, Professor Stephanie Burton, who is the lead of the Community of Practice for Postgraduate Education and Scholarship under the umbrella of Universities South Africa. And together, Stephanie and I run a number of initiatives to provide opportunities for conversation, for sharing, and for learning together about all things postgraduate. So you are all most welcome with us today. As many of you may know, South Africa has not in the past allowed for coursework within the doctorate to count for credit. Now, a number of us have been offering coursework as part of the doctorate for all sorts of reasons for many years now. The PhD program I run, has always included coursework of one kind or another. And we have found it to have all sorts of benefits and certainly some downsides too. But the fact that it could not be for credit meant that it perhaps wasn't as formalized as we would like it to be. So many of us were delighted to see in the draft Higher Education Qualifications sub-framework, which is up for comment at the moment, that there is an allowance for 120 credits out of the 360 credits to take the form of coursework. And quite a number of you in the room are from Kenya, where coursework was recently introduced. In fact, many would say it was mandated. And so they have had some early explorations of inclusion of coursework, and they've come across a few bumps in the road and some successes. And so we're really hoping that as they are one step ahead of us in Kenya, we can learn from their recent lessons. And so one of our presenters this afternoon is Dr. Patrick Onyango, and so he will be sharing the Kenyan experience. But we also have in the room 4 other countries with a much longer history of including coursework in the doctorate. And so I would like to say a very warm welcome to these speakers. And again, a big thank you for giving us your time and your insights. We've got Professor Paul Ashwin from Lancaster University in England, Professor Diane Negra from University College Dublin in Ireland. As I said, we've got Patrick from Kenya. We've got Professor Marie Peretti, Virginia Tech in the United States of America. And then we've got Professor Christine Tielken, who's from Vrije Universiteit in the Netherlands. So a wonderful spread of presenters who can share very different national experiences, different institutional experiences, and also different experiences across quite different disciplines, because of course these things can take different form depending on the kind of knowledge that our doctoral candidates are creating. So we've got a number of speakers and a fairly short space of time. I've asked each of our speakers to present for just 10 minutes, which is a very short time, but if they could keep to the 10 minutes, otherwise I shall interrupt them very rudely. And then after all 5 people have presented, we will have the remainder of the time for questions. So as people are presenting, feel free to pop notes into the chat bar or to scribble notes for yourself to raise later, but we will open it up for questions after all 5 people have presented. I think if it's okay, I'm just going to follow the order that's on the poster. So Paul, I'm going to make you up first. I'm going to stop sharing. You are welcome if people want to stop share. If people want to share their screen, you are very welcome to do so. If the presenters have a presentation. Yes, Paul has one and he's about to share. I'm going to turn off my camera. It probably is a good idea for us to turn off our cameras if we are not presenting, as that just helps with the bandwidth. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for being with us. Over to you. We can't hear you. You muted. Still muted.
Sorry, I'm working on it. Give me a sec.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
There we go.
As a participant, you're not allowed to unmute yourself, which is the cause for the delay in this case. Normally, it's my own incompetence, but not in this case.
Well, in this case, it was mine. So there you go. Over to you.
Thanks. So yeah, thanks, Sue, and thanks for the invitation to talk, and great to see so many people here. I'm going to talk about how we handle coursework in our doctoral programs, and really speak to the title of this seminar. So as Sue has already said, an initial caveat of what I'm going to say is that the nature of doing a PhD varies considerably according to the knowledge and PhD researchers involved. So I'm completely aware, my field is educational research. I'm completely aware that doing a PhD in educational research is nothing like doing a PhD in biochemistry. So we have to take account of that. And what I'm hoping you'll do is you'll take what's relevant in what I say, and you'll ignore what's irrelevant. The other thing that it changes in relation to is who are the PhD researchers. Education always involves introducing particular students in relation to particular bodies of knowledge. And if either of those things change, then what might be an effective practice will also change. So within Lancaster, our programs are focused on supporting mid-career professionals to undertake educational research on a part-time basis. We run 4 part-time structured doctoral programs and have about 400 PhD researchers enrolled on those programs. And the way in which those programs work is that they're structured into 2 parts. In what we call part 1, they do some structured modules, initially some support modules on research methods and reflective practices, and then also some core modules in which they're supported to produce publishable pieces of work. Because of that, in part 2, which goes from year 3 onwards, they produce a shorter thesis. So normally within the UK context, a thesis would be between 80 and 90,000 words. For these doctoral researchers, because they've done 3 publishable pieces of work in part 1, they do a thesis of around 45,000 words. So to give you a sense of how that works, I'm going to talk about the module that I convene. I direct our PhD program in higher education, research, evaluation and enhancement. And I also convene the first module that students do on policy change and enhancement in higher education, which runs from October to April. In fact, just yesterday, we were sending back the students their the grades on their final assignments. And so what we do in this module is we introduce PhD researchers to ideas of conceptualizing and researching higher education policy. They then produce an initial short research proposal for a study in this area. And then in an online setting, because this is a completely online program, we support them to develop their idea in this research proposal. They then submit an initial draft of the journal article in which I give them extensive formative feedback about how to ensure that it makes a publishable contribution to the literature. They use that feedback to submit a final version of the assignment on which they mainly just receive a summative feedback about whether it's of a publishable quality or not. So that's how we use coursework within the Lancaster context. And that's, it's very much focused on helping students to produce journal articles as they work themselves through the first 2 years of their PhD. And over that time, they'll do 3 of those modules. So will produce within 2 years 3 publishable pieces of work of around 7,000 to 8,000 words. So how I would see the limitations of our approach, if you wanted to stretch it further than the context we work in, the first thing I'd say is it's hugely dependent on the PhD researchers on that program having a professional context in which to undertake their research. They come to us from countries all over the world, but we introduce them to the initial ideas, but they need to have a higher education context in which they can take those ideas and do the coursework, produce the publishable pieces of work. Related to that, it relies on these PhD researchers having a rich understanding of their professional context. The way we understand our PhD research in our program is as co-researchers. They bring their expertise in their professional context. We bring our expertise in educational research, and together we help them to produce some research. So, as I've said, they tend to be mid-career. They tend to have a lot of experience. If this was a PhD program for people who just completed an undergraduate degree, the way in which we run it wouldn't work, because those PhD researchers wouldn't have the necessary rich educational understanding they need in order to engage with our programs. Thirdly, it's a real challenge for these students. As I've said, within the first 2 years of their PhD, these students are producing 3 publishable pieces of work, studying part-time. That's a huge challenge. It's something that most of our PhD researchers manage to do, but we mustn't underestimate the amount of work they have to do to achieve that. And then thirdly, we found within this approach, it works with about up to 30 PhD researchers at a time studying these structured modules. If you tried to do it with many more students than that, actually the way in which it works would start to break down. So it might be that if you've got a much larger cohort of PhD students, this might not be a particularly useful way of doing it. And then if we think about the strengths of our approach and how they enable graduate success, crucially, I would say it gets PhD researchers writing early in the PhD process. My experience of PhDs, and I think I've been sole supervisor to over 30 students now who've successfully completed, a key thing is to really get writing early in the PhD process. You can talk about a PhD endlessly, but until you have ideas down on paper that you can start to edit, develop, and think about further, you don't really start to make progress. So the ways in which this coursework and these structure programs get PhD researchers writing early is really important. The second thing it does, straight from the start of the PhD process, it gets PhD researchers used to making knowledge claims through writing publishable research. And as an examiner and as a supervisor, I've been involved in probably over 100 PhD examinations. And the more I'm involved in them, the less of a fine-grained judgment it is about whether a piece of work is a PhD or not. It either makes an original contribution to knowledge that might be finessed or might be developed further, but it either makes that contribution to knowledge or it doesn't. That's what's central to a PhD. So getting PhD researchers really used to what it means to try and make a claim to knowledge early in the PhD process is incredibly useful. Thirdly, one of the crucial things about our programs is that, as I've said, we have a cohort of about 30 mid-career professionals studying part-time going through this process together. And the support they give each other, the comments they give each other on each other's work, the way they say, come on, we're all going to graduate together, is a major advantage that coursework gives. I did my own PhD part-time while working full-time, but I did it on my own. And when I work with my current PhD researchers, I really envy that sense of cohort they have and the support that's provided by that cohort. The fourth thing it does is very early in the PhD process, it gets PhD researchers used to the fact that doing a PhD is about knowing more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. My sense of when students come to PhDs in educational research, they often come with really big, important questions that they want to answer. And a lot of the PhD process is realizing that actually they can answer a tiny part of that question. And often students, PhD researchers, experience that as a sense of loss, that this big question they started with is something that they can only do a very small part of. So the earlier that PhD researchers realize that and start to understand that, you know, doing a PhD is the most highly specialized piece of knowledge in the world. It's not about being amazingly intelligent. It's about having stamina and keeping going in order to make a very specialized contribution to knowledge. And thirdly, fifthly, this is a way in which working in these structured modules really enables us to demystify the research process for students, really get them to understand what it involves. And again, that can sometimes be a sense of loss for PhD researchers because they want it to be mystical. They want the kind of prestige of doing a PhD, whereas what we try and do is try and make it every day and really help them to understand what they need in order to get a PhD. And I'll finish there.
Wow, that was excellent. For content was excellent, but I must also say timing, brilliant, Paul, spot on. Thank you so much. Okay, so next up, I've no longer got the, oh, there we go. Thank you so much. Thanks, Paul. If we can keep, there are some comments in the chat bar, which you're welcome to have a look at. But we will also have time for questions at the end. So next up, we've got Professor Diane Negra, who is joining us from University College Dublin. Thank you so much for joining us, Diane. We haven't had the opportunity to meet before now, so just thank you so much for taking up Stephanie's invitation to you. I don't know if you want to share a screen. If you do, please go ahead.
I'm going to go ahead and speak only. So I'm not
No
going to do any
problem.
sort of PowerPoint. Yeah, I'm truly a humanities person, as you'll see. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be speaking with you from Dublin. The sun is shining here, and you may know how unusual that is. So I should say at the outset that I'm an academic who trained in the United States, but I've worked for long periods of time in the UK and Ireland, and also I've held quite a few visiting posts as well. I can see that you're not seeing me, but hopefully you will now. We'll see how that goes. And Sue, please tell me if you're lacking anything on my side.
No, we can see you and we can hear you.
You can. Okay, that's good then. But in the process of putting that on, I have been closed out of a function that I was working in. So let me see if I can get that back open. Hopefully I can. I'm not really sure why it just kind of hung up there. These are the hazards of technology, I suppose. Let's see. Bear with me, guys. One quick second.
No problem. If you want to turn off if that'll help.
I think I better not change anything because it was changing the thing that sort of zapped the document, and the document I'm reading from is still there. But whenever I attempt to open it, since the camera came on, it will not open. So I'm going to see if I can just, yeah, there we go. Okay, so I was starting to say that my perspective is essentially triangulated. I think of it that way, which is to say that I've spent most of my career in the US, Ireland, and the UK. And so I tend to think comparatively about what works best in all of those different environments when it comes to administrative and curricular matters. I've worked a lot with MA and PhD students through my whole career, and I've also directed an MA program in the United States and a large doctoral program in the UK before I came here to Dublin. So I want to talk first about the US. In the US, as many will know, it's conventional to take 2 full years of coursework before sitting qualifying exams that mark then the transition into candidacy. And only at that point does the work on a dissertation begin in earnest. One benefit of this approach is that it generally provides a sturdy foundation of disciplinary knowledge, and it also functions, I think it's fair to say it furnishes junior academics with a good portfolio of potential teaching down the line. As a result, the crucial sort of 2 or 3 years post-PhD are less likely to be taken up with course development, and the early career researcher can forge ahead developing articles and books for publication, which really is so crucial for all sorts of reasons. The drawback, of course, is that it is slow, and the completion time for a doctorate in the humanities in the United States has hovered around 7 years for a long time. The coursework that I did at the University of Texas at Austin varied wildly in its quality and relevance to the work I was doing in media theory and history. Subject seminars tended to be populated by a mix of MA and doctoral students, and some of these were robust and even inspirational. Some of the term papers that I wrote for those seminars gave me the opportunity to develop proficiency in new research methodologies and to begin to carve out intellectual pathways that ultimately fed into my PhD. Others, speaking frankly, were a pure waste of time, focusing on approaches that were completely unrelated to my work. A weekly seminar across the large department that I was a part of showcased work in progress. I'm a big believer in these kinds of seminars. Each PhD student was required to give 2 presentations, one of which would be the proposal for the PhD. And then in principle, not always in practice, presenters would receive feedback from all of the faculty members in attendance. In other words, it was assumed that all members of faculty would come to these weekly seminars. I think the other thing that happened in that context was a kind of shorter seminar, certainly fewer hours in a classroom, but that was specifically devoted to developing presentational skills. I think that was very useful, although as Stephanie and I were discussing in Dublin the other week, I'm also seeing a change in our incoming postgraduate students where I tend to think of them as very precocious. And I think digital self-presentation has become such a norm that maybe that's less of a need than it once was. But the value of coursework in the US context was that students moved into the PhD with a kind of comprehensive, in-depth knowledge of the field, and they could envision their place in it in an informed way. I think there's a lot of value in that. And then at times, and this goes back to a conversation made by Paul a moment ago, it could also feed into a culture of scholarly camaraderie, which is quite important. I should maybe just add before moving on that the convention in the US is to have a 5-person doctoral committee with high involvement by the supervisor or post-supervisors, and then varying levels of engagement by other members of the committee. But my point is that there's customarily more access to a larger range of faculty than in the UK and Ireland, where it tends to be quite supervisor driven. So in the UK, although informally a doctoral student might sit in on an MA seminar in whole or in part, the doctoral students that I worked with in the UK about 20 years ago had no coursework requirement. I suspect that's probably started to change now. The absence of coursework led to 2 urgent necessities. One, that the doctoral supervisor be highly conscientious in helping the student to build relevant knowledge, and 2, that the student be sufficiently mature to identify and remedy intellectual deficits. Those are big demands, and they frequently go unmet. The conditions of doctoral work also, I think, led to a greater likelihood of a student working in exactly the same area as the supervisor, or even, in my view, regrettably, the supervisor dictating the dissertation topic to the student. In our doctoral program at the University of East Anglia, where I then worked, 65 students worked in a variety of media studies subjects with a loose expectation that they casually present their work in a work-in-progress seminar. Some did this conscientiously, many didn't. And struggling students often failed to present and were marginalized, and supervisors were not always forthcoming about those circumstances. So overall, I would say that the risks of loneliness and isolation for doctoral students were quite considerable. Successful PhDs who later found employment often spent their first years in a lectureship then also building their pedagogy from more or less a standing start because they didn't have that coursework base. Thirdly, I'd like to talk about Ireland. At University College Dublin, our doctoral students are required to take 30 taught credits and complete an online research integrity training. I think this is comparable to most Irish third-level institutions like Trinity and Maynooth, and this coursework is almost always at MA level. I really want to stress that. Sometimes opting out is possible through what's called recognition of prior learning. PhD students are compelled to do this coursework, but there is not always a good assortment of modules for them to take. I think this is really quite a significant problem, particularly for those in smaller subject areas. A wonderful example of an interdisciplinary doctoral seminar that we do have in UCD is a colleague's critical acting module, which focuses specifically on the gap between critical analysis that is often socially idealistic and the conditions on the ground in neoliberal universities. And modules like that, I think, are wonderful, but I also think they are quite rare around here. So when a doctoral student takes one of my MA seminars, I try to sustain a side conversation with them about the relevance of the seminar material to their research. And I would add that having a doctoral student in an MA seminar can sometimes be highly beneficial for mature, advanced MA students. And I have seen firsthand, including this semester, the inspirational effect that a PhD student can have on strong MA students when they take part in such seminars. That doesn't necessarily help the PhD student, although it may, kind of hone their mentorship skills, but it definitely helps the seminar. So in closing, I'd like to make 5 points. The first is this. If we consider what constitute unacceptable deficits in PhD education, as we should, it seems to me that we will talk about coursework more and more. Secondly, there are large questions in play about how to make completing coursework at doctoral level viable and meaningful, and relatively few examples of good practice. Maybe the cases of good practice we could point to come from universities that enjoy very nice levels of resourcing that isn't necessarily the norm. Thirdly, doctoral coursework experiences can be critical to building skills in professionalization and collegiality while conveying an important sense of community. Fourth, there's great value in a well-run weekly seminar in which students present drafts of their work to other doctoral students and ideally also to faculty. And then finally, the nature and norms of information seeking are currently undergoing drastic change. The incorporation of robust in-person discussion of scholarly ethics will be needed as new challenges to academic integrity loom in the age of AI. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All sorts of really useful ideas there again, and strong echoes between the two presentations around the need for community and collegiality and spaces to try out ideas. Thank you so much, Diane. And next up, we've got Patrick. Patrick, over to you. If you want to share your screen, you're welcome to do so.
Hi, so my background doesn't look okay here. So I'm just going to turn the video off and share my presentation.
Sure.
Let's see. I am excited to be here, Sue, and thank you so very much for extending this invitation. I want to take a slightly different approach here and try and answer a much larger question of whether the coursework is needed at the doctorate. That is the question that I'm trying, hopefully, to answer, and I'm going to frame this in an African context. Now I can't find how to turn that video off. My screen is perhaps too large here. So my framing of this is going to be in an African context, and we see how that goes. And in doing so, here's how the life of this short presentation is going to be lived. I'm going to talk about the realities of doctoral education in Africa. I'll talk about coursework in doctoral education in Kenya, but briefly just glossing over it. Then ask a question of whether, how is it working so far, some score sheet using some low-lying fruits metrics, just one of those, and then do a wrap-up. So here is some of the realities of what I see as doctoral education in Africa more broadly, that we see that most doctoral students are self-sponsored, and that means then they have to struggle to balance their time in study, their life, and their employment, because they have to get the funding to support their studies. That has serious implications on the role that then coursework will play. The other point is that Africa enrolls, or those who are enrolling for doctoral education or into doctoral programs are typically older. It's an older demographic. Not all of them, but enough are older. And so they're coming into the doctorate, the requirement of which is having a master's for us here. And sometimes the master's was done so many years ago. And so one would see that their grounding, is questionable, or they need to be retooled. to have the skill sets to be able to participate in the conversations that they intend to engage in. The other thing is we live in a period of massification, a high number of students seeking higher education. If you look at Africa in the 70s, 1969, I believe, we had only 170 universities. Now the number of universities is about 2,000. And that also applies to enrollment into doctoral programs. And the consequence here is that while that number has been going on, we have low capacity, supervision capacity. And so there's a struggle there. And so there are concerns about the quality of supervision and therefore the quality of the doctorate. When you're being supervised by fatigued individuals, there are fewer of them and they have so many students in their care. So there are questions about that. And so the question then is, can coursework help plug some of those gaps so that then quality is enhanced? The other matter here as a reality in our continent is that we contribute 2 to 5% of publications in journals. And so that has a problem. The question we ask overall, therefore, is whether coursework can help address some of these challenges so that we can contribute as a continent more meaningfully to knowledge production and the other discourses that come with the doctorate. The Kenyan case, Kenya has about 37 chartered public universities, 27 chartered private universities. The quality of university education is overseen by a commission. The Commission for University Education is what we call it. And that commission was established by an act of parliament. In about 2017, 2018, the commission gave a directive. Some of us think it was a directive. Some of us think it was a guidance that universities that were offering doctoral programs should introduce coursework in those programs. And the reasoning behind this is that the commission found that students who are enrolling for doctoral programs were not grounded in their foundation, the foundations of their disciplines. Neither did they have the kind of knowledge of research methodologies that would enable them to undertake research with the kind of vigor that is expected at the doctoral level. In addition, they also found, they had evidence, they tell me, that universities that have been offering or were already offering PhD by coursework, research, and thesis were recording or reporting higher completion rates for doctoral students compared to those that were just doing PhD via research and thesis. So that motivation there and the quest to have more numbers also was behind this. And they guided, they mandated that the coursework should form at least a third, no less than a third of the program. So in 2018, 2018, universities started to roll out or implement a revised doctoral curriculum with PhD. At Maseno University, we have 8 modules, 4 in the first semester and 4 in the second semester. Here we also require them to teach at least one course per semester or one module per semester. At the end of it, we give them a minimum of 3 years to complete all this and a maximum of 5 years, which never happens, right? Very few students graduate within that time frame. And they also need to come up with 2 publications. So that is the nature of it. And so the question for our university is where are we with the coursework, or is it too early for us to be able to make an evaluation? Can we make the case that we can start to assess or examine how that is going? As I said earlier, I'm going to use one of the low-lying metrics, which is proportion of students completing their studies within the stipulated maximum period of 5 years. And so I used data just 2 years. I picked because we introduced coursework, and not long after that there was the COVID pandemic, and so I tried to look for 2 years that are close enough in terms of what the world was experiencing. So the 2017 cohort that did not do coursework, 8% of them completed their studies within 5 years. The 2018 cohort, which was doing coursework, 5% completed their studies within 5 years. I think it is too early to start throwing these numbers around, but I think they begin to give us a sense of where things are. And so we go back to those realities and ask the question, is coursework a potential delay factor? And if it can be a potential delay factor, what kind of mechanisms can we place, or what kind of interventions can we put in place to check that? As we wrap up, I want to talk about, I think that coursework has to be context specific, or is likely to be conceived in that perspective. And this could be from the learner's perspective. The presenter earlier was saying that you can opt out of certain courses and take others, or can it be just a one-size-fits-all? That is a question that can be looked at. But more importantly, I think as we look at that context, we may gain some understanding on whether we can use coursework at the doctorate to do things that are beyond what a supervisor can do to a doctoral student, and hopefully have modules that can tool or upskill doctoral students to contribute to the common good. So use the doctoral curriculum and use coursework to think about graduate attributes and elevate in terms of redefining or having a clear definition for the purpose of the doctorate that goes beyond what would you call it, the mechanics of the process, but have individuals that the society expecting much from, but also then give much in return. I want to thank you all for listening. This presentation is coming from, I think, arising in large part from conversations I've had with colleagues in different projects, as well as those at my university here, given my position at the School of Graduate Studies. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I really enjoyed hearing the Kenyan case study, but also just the introduction of sort of more overview of what is happening across our continent. Thank you so much for that. Okay, now we move on to, I must say, these are incredibly obedient speakers. Let's see if the next two are as good on time. Really, very impressive. Marie, can I hand over to you to
Yes, I can't. Patrick has to stop sharing for me to be able to
you
share.
can stop sharing. There you go. Great.
Okay, great. And you all can see that. So hi, everybody. The advantage of going late is many things have already been said. So I'm going to try to build a little bit. As we said, I'm Marie Peretti. I'm a professor in the Department of Engineering Education at Virginia Tech, which is in the United States. Really quickly, I would like to just highlight my journey because Diane talked a little bit about comparison across countries. I'm going to talk a little bit about comparison across fields because I've moved through many of them in my career. So my undergraduate degree is in chemical engineering, and I did a master's in English and worked. I did a PhD in English and worked. And somehow I ended up in engineering education as a professor out of all of that. And that's an important context. One of the things we said at the very beginning is the ways in which coursework are very field dependent. So I'm going to try to highlight a little bit of that as I talk. So seeing it from different sides. My own PhD was in the field of English, coming from an undergraduate degree in engineering and a minor in English, followed by a master's in English. And in my PhD, similar to what Diane talked about, the department required breadth at the master's level. And if you came to the PhD without that knowledge breadth, so specific areas of literature, you had to take any makeup courses that you might be missing. I happen to be missing most of the 17th century, so I was required to take a course to fill that breadth. And then within the PhD, you chose a major area of concentration, and there was a coursework number of courses required in your concentration area, but the students could choose which courses you took. We were also required to have a minor field of study. Again, the student could choose that. The number of courses were specified. We also required a foreign language competency exam. So I had to pass 2 foreign language tests. So that was in the humanities in literature. My current work in engineering education, where I'm a PhD advisor to students, is a little bit different with many more requirements. And one of the pieces, and I'll come back to this point, is that engineering education is an interdisciplinary field. There really are no undergraduate or master's degrees in the field. So we require 18 courses. 4 are specified, and they cover many of the things I think that the previous presenters have talked about. There's a required course in overview of research methods of the field. There's a required course in theoretical frameworks. There's a required course in current issues and sort of the contemporary landscape of the field. And there's actually a required course in design of pedagogical experiences. We also require a small departmental seminar that students have to take for their first 4 semesters. There's a required seminar at the college level. And then beyond that, there are a series of bounded electives. So students are required to take an advanced course in research methods, but the course itself is their choice, decided in conjunction with their advisor. As I said, engineering education is this interdisciplinary space. We require a cognate of 4 courses in the social sciences that, again, are student choice in discussion with their advisor and committee, 4 courses within engineering, and then a set of elective courses. They can transfer some of that coursework from the master's degree across all of those different areas, depending on what they've had. The other experience I've had, though, is as a program leader of an interdisciplinary certificate in disaster resilience that spanned sort of doctoral and master's students. And that program is a certificate program at Virginia Tech. So it's not a formal degree program. Students are still getting degrees in their home department, be it mechanical engineering or urban affairs and planning or public health or geosciences. But they get an additional credential, the certificate in disaster resilience. And there are a number of those at Virginia Tech. It's somewhat akin to a minor at the undergraduate level. It required 4 courses. 2 of them were specified, and then 2 of them had to be courses from a sort of a set list outside the student's major. And that was open to any student, any graduate student at the university. So really different sets of domains, experiences, and requirements in terms of coursework. So when I look across advantages and disadvantages or possibilities and limitations, I'm going to echo, I think, some of what other folks have said. Key, I think, in a lot of the coursework models is this idea of building a shared knowledge base. It's a place where you bring students together to make sure that they have an understanding of the critical issues in the field in which they're working with. What do we already know? What are the theories that we might work with? What are the gaps and the opportunities to continue? Where do we build new knowledge? What does the field look like now? Has also come up in terms of research expectations. I think a couple folks have mentioned. As I said, we in engineering education have a course in research methods. The interdisciplinary program I directed, one of the required courses was really about methods and issues. It's a way to think about making sure students understand the fundamental ways in which this discipline constructs knowledge. What are the methods available to us? How do we use them? What does that mean? What are the epistemologies or knowledge building frameworks we use? What do we mean by quality in research? And then the other piece, which I think is really important, which has also come up a couple of times, is this idea of creating community. When you bring in graduate students together in a cohort and they're taking a set of required courses together, they build a supportive network in which they find peers who can help them through the difficult stages. We've all said PhDs are difficult. Retention is a challenge. Community in that, people to study with, people to talk with, people to bounce ideas off, are really critical in helping students see themselves within a doctoral program, understand how they fit in, and form this supportive community. But then it also builds research collaborations that tend to progress past the end of the PhD. A lot of the fields I've worked in, sort of certainly engineering education and disaster resilience, do a lot more collaborative work. And so that ability to have a network of collaborators after one leaves is also important. The limitations that I'll highlight, I think similar to what we've seen before, they do constrain in some ways, depending on how they're structured, what students can think about and what choices they can make in terms of courses they can take. That was particularly challenging in directing the interdisciplinary program. I worked with students from across the university. Engineering tended to be the most restrictive and have the most coursework, which meant students really struggled to take courses outside of the very narrow list of courses required by their department. So if they wanted to learn beyond the boundaries of the discipline, to think about what their work might mean in the context of larger global challenges like climate change and disasters, they really struggled with that extra, trying to get in anything outside the bounds. And ultimately, in some ways, coursework can delay the onset of starting your own research, and it can extend time to degree, which I think has come up. It doesn't have to, and I think the way Paul talked about the way coursework functioned there was a really important consideration. How do we or don't we do that? So I'll end with a couple considerations briefly that I think we need to think about in terms of how coursework might work. One is to think about the student trajectories. It is very different to think about coursework if you're dealing with students who've come through a bachelor's and a master's degree in the same field versus students who may be changing fields as they go. I'm clearly a field changer. A division like engineering education, we are getting students whose undergraduate and perhaps master's degrees are elsewhere. So the questions I would pose are, what is the extent of the shared knowledge base of your incoming students? How well do they understand the breadth of the field? How well do they understand research methods? Do they know how one approaches research, not just the content of the field, but how does one make new knowledge? Do they need training in that? And then to what extent do you want those requirements to be fixed or flexible? You can specify required courses, you can specify domains and give students choice. And if you're going to have choice, who's going to approve those and what's the involvement of the supervisor going to be? And I will conclude there and open it up to questions. So.
Great, thank you so much. And again, this issue is about preparedness, but also about changing knowledge fields. I think that's a really crucial one, particularly as transdisciplinary studies become more and more common. We are going to have more and more students sort of moving between one field at master's and another field at doctorate, and that obviously brings all sorts of things with it. Okay, next up we have Christine. Christine from Vrije Universiteit in the Netherlands. Christine and I are actually co-supervising a student together. And so it's lovely to meet you.
Hello, Sue. Thanks
today.
so much for inviting me to this seminar.
I don't know if you want to share a screen, Christine, or you.
Yeah, I will try. I will try. And really great to be here on this. It's a very gloomy afternoon here in Amsterdam. It's very rainy. Thanks for inviting me, and also it's really great, amazing to see so many people attending. That's really great. I'm the sorry, I need to
Are you trying to share your screen? And I think you may have frozen, Christine. Okay, we seem to have lost Christine. Am I right?
Hello.
Oh, there we go. There, you're back.
Sorry, I'm still working on the sharing. Sorry. Oh. Um,
In the meantime, I can just let everyone know that there's lots of discussion happening in the chat. So you're welcome to put questions and comments in the chat. And any of our presenters who would like to reply to any of the comments, please feel free to go ahead and do so.
Christine, you're welcome to email your presentation to me and I can share it on your behalf if you'd like to
oh,
do
that
that.
would be great because I have some issues with my sharing. Sorry about that. I'm not sure. I'm using someone else's computer, so maybe that's the issue. Let me give a few. Oh.
I think while we are waiting for Christine, and don't stress, Christine, you can just email that to Shiloh and she will put it on.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Sorry.
No problem. But in the meantime, let's see if there's, oh, there we go. We've got it. We've got it.
Oh, okay.
Oh, no, she's sharing something else. In the meantime, I thought let's take a question. Let's ask Marina, who takes, Myrna Mayer has a question, I think, for Paul around the article writing. Myrna asks, who takes ownership of the article writing on the PhD afterwards? I don't know if you want to come in there, Paul, around the issue of, I'm not sure ownership, if it's ownership as an authorship, or how do you manage the authorship of the articles?
So I mean, it varies a little bit across my department, but certainly my practice and a number of my colleagues is that we see the work that both the coursework and the thesis work that students do as their work, as their contribution to the field. So unless we feel we've made a significant contribution to developing the original contribution to knowledge, our students publish under their own names. We encourage them to acknowledge Lancaster. They can have Lancaster as the place where they did the research if they want to, but if it's important for them to have it as their own institution, they do that. And often this relates to the experience that supervisors had themselves. So my experience with my PhD supervisor was that he left me to publish under my name. So we don't, so I only publish with my PhD students, A, if they really want me to and ask me to, and B, if I feel I've actually made a contribution to the journal article that I consider to be significant.
Great, that's really useful. And as you point out, you can always have dual affiliation. If they are working at a university, they can put their university plus the university where they did the study, which is in your case Lancaster. while we are still waiting for Christine's presentation to come up, let me ask Marie. You've made a comment here about the interdisciplinary spaces, students working in interdisciplinary spaces, and the implications for coursework. I wonder if you could just come in and tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think you know, the world is increasingly complex, and contributions to knowledge that our students will be expected to make once they leave the university, whether they go to academic positions or non-academic positions, I think require a certain level of interdisciplinary understanding. And I put this in the chat. One of the things that I saw in the interdisciplinary disaster resilience program, particularly the engineering programs, were very course heavy. They had a lot of required content courses that students had to take. And that meant that if a student who was working, say, in civil engineering on designing infrastructure wanted to understand urban planning or public health, the opportunity to take a course in that space and come to understand the issues and the methods and the concerns that other disciplines might bring was really quite limited. And some people have a philosophy that the PhD really is about that depth. I mean, Paul mentioned, you know, knowing more and more about less and less. But in other ways, there's a time and space when one is in graduate school to really stretch your intellectual muscles in a way that I think is often much harder to do once you get a job outside of graduate school. So I think creating that space to allow students who want to move beyond their discipline and understand relevant issues around their work is important. I mean, even in my own PhD in the humanities, my program required a minor field, and that minor field could be anything, and it could be related to anything you wanted, but there was a set number of courses you had to take beyond your chosen area of literary specialty, and that builds an awareness, I think, of how the depth in one domain might impact and be impacted by what's going on in other fields, and also just how other fields make knowledge, which is very different, which is why we can't collaborate, because we all have very different standards for what counts as data and knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly one of the things I think we all want our doctoral candidates to leave with is a bit of a sense of humility that they've learned how to make knowledge in a particular area in a particular way, and that there are other valid and valuable ways. Thank you so much for that. And I can see that Christine's slides are now on the screen, and I see that you're going to be touching on artificial intelligence, which is something that Diane briefly mentioned at the end, and certainly is an important trend in higher education at the moment. Let me hand over to you, Christine.
Yes, apologies for the delay, but yeah, up to now we were on a very strict time schedule, so you did very well. You did very well, Sue. Until I come in, can I have the next slide, please? What I really liked about this seminar is that it's rather broad. It's rather the focus was rather broad, and in that way, I noticed that all the other presenters have each their own focus, which I really liked. And the focus of my presentation will be more on, not so much on individual PhD candidate, but more on the PhD system in general. Can I have the next slide, please? And what I would like to focus is on the value of the PhD title for the labor market, and this is the building from the Free University in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, the organization of the graduate schools and the well-being of the PhD candidates. It's kind of a multi-level approach, and here you can see. And from existing research, we know how strongly these three are connected, and I mean, there's you could see that in general the whole PhD is in transition. But some of its features are still it's still built on a kind of 19th century system with a master apprentice idea, which is still present. Some of the features of this individual relationship are still there, while also the PhD system has been organized into what we call the graduate school system, which had a huge impact on how PhDs pursue their title. And there are a few essential developments. So, I mean, you can probably imagine that this quite strict and bureaucratic organization of graduate schools doesn't sit so easily more with this former master apprentice system. So you could really see a tension between these two. And another crucial development involves, of course, the value of the PhD title for the labor market. Well, it's probably very similar in South Africa and Kenya as well. But what we see in the Netherlands and in other European countries as well is that only about 1/3 of the PhDs tend to stay in academia, and a lot of people go somewhere else. So then that raises questions for how prepared are these PhDs for the labor market? Does it still fit? Does the whole PhD system still fit its purpose in all these developments? Next slide, please. And given these developments, given the retentions, the delay, the dropout, many other developments, I think that we really should strive for a new type of PhD system. And I think in such a new system, coursework could really have an important place. I'm really in favor on not so much an output-based, like a single output-based PhD system where PhD candidates graduate often with an in vivo, with a book or with a couple of articles. But I would be in favor for a much more portfolio-oriented system. So we're not simply producing degree students, but we're having an important step in the development of knowledge. I think our focus on PhDs should be much broader, with a wider assessment and with a much clearer focus on the individual contribution to research. What from my own investigations, I could see there's a kind of what we call a bottleneck in the PhD outflow. On one hand, PhDs feel unprepared for working outside academia. On the other hand, we see that our greatest talents are sometimes wasted for not being able or willing to stay in academia. So it's a precarious balance between these two. And the last thing is that in terms of supervision, the supervisors are often unable to recognize the diversity of talent. I mean, one PhD may be very good at publishing, but another may be good at project management or giving presentations or teaching. So next slide, please, Shiloh. Yeah, so as I said, I would be in favor of a more portfolio-oriented assessment. I could see from the 4 previous presentations that in some types of PhD system that's already there, but I can also see lots of room for development. And in such a portfolio-oriented approach, I think there's lots of room for what you call coursework. And then, of course, then it's always the next question, like what kind of coursework, how would you organize it? But yeah, if you look at a more portfolio-oriented approach, these issues on the slide could be part of it. Like, why don't we expect our PhDs to practice in reviewing, to doing peer assessments, but also act as reviewers for journals, for example, perhaps on the supervision, perhaps independent. But there are lots of, I see it as a basket where lots of different valuable capacities could be present. Another aspect involves teaching. I think it's very important that PhD candidates also learn how to teach others, especially if they want to stay in academia. It's very helpful if they know about it as well. And then, of course, well, I'm sure you're all familiar with the transferable skills like presentation skills, project management skills. And then, of course, the last issue involves the preparation for post-PhD careers. Where do you want to go from your PhD onwards? And of course, that really greatly depends on the discipline and on also maybe the phase of your career. But I could see that also as part of this kind of portfolio-oriented assessments. So that's all for now. Maybe you can give the next slide. Here are the what we call the important duurzaam, the sustainable goals. And I think if we have these goals at hand, they should be related to a more portfolio-oriented and also more sustainable PhD system. That's all for now. Thanks, everyone. And apologies again for the delay.
No problem. Thank you so much for that. Again, very useful, a really rich spread of presentations.
Yeah.
I'm going to hand over to my colleague Stephanie now. You're muted. We can see you, but we can't hear you.
Yeah,
there we go.
Sorry, it was that thing about the host needing to make it happen. I apologize. So thank you. Let me just make a couple of general observations about how this very interesting discussion has gone, and then we'll open up for some questions or comments from everybody who's here. Just to, as I say, summarize one or two points that occur to me as I've been listening to this, that we've moved from where we started, which was saying we now have an opportunity in South Africa and in other places as well to add coursework. Now, one of the things we haven't dealt with, and I won't go into lots of detail, but we will need to consider is the issue of credit and credit-bearing coursework as opposed to building kind of coursework, the kind of coursework that enables skills and so on. But we have this consideration of how are we going to put coursework into our doctoral programs. And it's interesting that we need to think about some particular issues. For example, if we do put in coursework, and this is my connection with the credits, is what do we require as the tangible outputs of that coursework? And obviously from our discussions, there are many different tangible outputs and products of that coursework, some of it being understanding of a broader environment, some of it being an enrichment, if you like, but other parts of it being a requirement for learning new or essential elements of the work. So it occurs to me that we haven't really discussed in detail, and maybe it varies, how one assesses the coursework. How does it become a part of the assessment of the doctoral program? And I think that's something we are going to need to grapple with when we introduce these coursework issues. And then the other part of it is, to what extent do we say it's compulsory? And to what extent do we allow it to be a choice, if you like? We heard particularly from Marie, the very interesting sort of structure where students choose particular courses that they require that will, what sounds to me, will really broaden their knowledge, allow them to take perhaps a more mature approach to their own research. So we're seeing a lot of different approaches to why the coursework is there. The way in which it's functioning or it's implemented, obviously, is also different in terms of students taking courses and then being assessed presumably separately for those courses, as opposed to the doctoral program itself, including credits towards the final assessment. there's complexity there that we haven't yet, I think, clarified. I think it's been interesting to hear, and something that really does speak to me, having worked in several different areas, is the importance of using that coursework as a way of ensuring a grounding in the foundations of the discipline or disciplines that the student is going to need for their research. We talk in our context frequently about the preparedness of our students coming into their doctoral programs, and the inclusion of coursework of different types, I think, is going to be a really useful way of addressing that issue of preparedness. And that goes across whether it's research methodology and preparation for research, whether it's in fact disciplinary based, or whether it has some of those very interesting aspects, such as inclusion of social sciences in, for example, an engineering degree, where that is about the broad base and about the transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary nature of the research program that the student is going to undertake. And then my last comment I thought I'd just highlight is, it just sparked off particularly by what Christine had to say, and that is that we are still, I think, expecting doctoral studies to result in an original contribution to knowledge in a particular area. But in the modern context today, we do require understanding of the broader environment, and in particular the impact of the research that's being done. So it brings us full circle right back to the purpose of the doctoral degree. And in the system that I very much liked Christine's idea about a system for a PhD, which speaks not only to tangible outputs, but also to the broader knowledge, the portfolio idea, but the broad knowledge that a doctoral student will come out with at the end of their study. And that also brings us to what we in this country call the graduate attributes, the nature of the person who comes out of a doctoral program. So those are a whole lot of thoughts that come out of this very rich discussion. And let me stop there and invite people. I do see some of the comments in the chat, and I will refer back to those. But if anybody would like to put up your hand and make a comment or ask a question or in real time, if you like, please do go ahead. If you can find it, if you need to find the hand, it'll be under the little button called React, and if you click on that little heart symbol, you'll find a hand there that you can raise. Marie, please go ahead.
Yeah, Stephanie, I wanted to comment a little bit on your question about assessment and how one assesses the outcome of coursework. Because I think our PhD program has a number of different milestones that students have to pass. And again, in engineering education, there is really no undergraduate or master's program that students are coming from. They might have a master's in education, but they might have a master's in engineering. They might be straight from bachelor's and be getting a master's concurrent with their PhD in a different field. And so one of the things that we do, apart from the course grades for that set of core required courses in engineering education, methods, theories, issues in the field, students have to take those courses before they take their qualifying exam. And the qualifying exam really is one way that our program sort of looks at students and says, okay, you came with a master's in civil engineering, or you came with an MBA and an undergraduate in mining engineering. Do you now understand, after a year of this coursework, how this field works and how we put things together? So there's a common exam that all students are required to take that basically asks them to design a couple of small research studies as a way to say, like, yes, you've made the epistemological and ontological transition. We see that you can do the thing, and now go think about your dissertation. And that really is about the idea that they've transitioned from fields, and we are trying to understand whether they've made the epistemological and ontological shifts.
Thank you. So different in different parts of the world. Just taking your hands in order, Henry, if you would like to go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. Interesting, fascinating presentations and questions in the chat and responses. Henry from Wits University here. And my discipline is program or curriculum design and development in the space of quality assurance. So it touches very close to home. And I liked Christine's talk around system overhaul. I would refer to it as system overhaul a bit, but also also looking at the question of the purpose of a doctoral program. I mean, having worked in this space for a while, you've seen amendments of after amendments of requirements and other things. What makes up a PhD program and other master's programs and other things. So the question is, can we then, along the lines of Christine, just go back and say, what is the purpose? What do we mean by original contribution? Can we dissect that and say, what does it mean? And especially across disciplines. I mean, in humanities, this can mean something else. And in the field of Marie, it can be a major discovery in chemistry, in chemical engineering. So maybe the question is to go back and really look at what do we mean by an original contribution, or do we need an original contribution in the manner that we would have defined it? So it's more of a question statement type of thing. So instead of just revising, periodically revising and adding things, patching onto other things, let's go back and maybe if we do that, a system overhaul, we can start to see clearly what is it that we require. Is the coursework then, does it make sense in the new definition or outlook of what a PhD contribution to research means?
Thank you for raising that, Henry. It speaks very clearly to some of my views on the original contribution. But I know that Paul feels strongly about that. And before I hand over to him, let me say that the other discussion that we haven't had is what is the difference between what we call a professional doctorate, where it's all coursework and it's very little in the way of an original contribution. And how do we align those issues? So let me hand over to Paul to speak now, and I think he's going to speak about the idea of the original contribution. Paul, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. I really am that predictable. Yeah, for me, I'm kind of wary of stretching the definition of a PhD, not because other things aren't important, but simply because a PhD does one thing. It involves making a claim for an original contribution to knowledge. Henry's raising the question of what does that mean, and what it means completely depends on the body of knowledge that students are writing in relation to. So part of what you do as a PhD student is you evoke a particular body of knowledge, you create a sense of what that body of knowledge looks like, and then you situate your contribution. So within that, there's all kinds of possibilities for invoking new bodies of knowledge in new ways. So I recently had a PhD student who was writing his PhD on acting curricula in UK universities, and he wrote it as a play. The whole thesis was written in the form of a play to be read. So it's not that sets limits on what a PhD can be, it's simply that it recognizes that's what a PhD does. And there might be other things you want to do that are incredibly important and maybe even more important than a PhD, but they're not a PhD. And so for me, it doesn't help anyone if we stretch these definitions to try and be more inclusive. Let's actually work to make other things as equally important as a PhD, rather than turning a PhD into other things.
Thank you, Paul. This is, yeah, we could talk for a long time, I think. But Marie next. Marie?
Yeah, I think sort of adding to that conversation, and I go back to this idea of different fields. When we talk about a contribution to knowledge and the outcome of the PhD, we have to recognize that different students are going to need different things based on their field. So for example, if you want to become an academic in English, the dissertation in the US is likely to be the basis for your first book, but because tenure, if you're going to become an academic, requires a book. And so your committee is looking at that and saying, will this person get a book out of this? In other fields, the PhD articles, at least some of them, should be published. If you're doing individual manuscripts, your PhD might be a collection of 3 manuscripts. Some fields may require that some of those already be published because the publication of articles is what matters. If you're moving into a more practice-based field, you may have practical implications. So even the nature of that knowledge contribution and the output, and this goes back to the questions Christine raised about workforce preparation, how a field views contribution, I think, can be very different. And we need to be aware of that too. Somebody wrote in the comments, this is not a one-size-fits-all model, I don't think. There has to be, I mean, I'm kind of with Paul that there is something about, like, the PhD is kind of a research degree. Otherwise, you could get multiple master's degrees in different fields and build knowledge. But what we mean by contribution is not going to be the same, and what it's going to look like in its form. So,
Sure, thank you. Christine, you're muted.
I'm always in favor of professional autonomy. I think probably many of you are. I would be really in favor of a kind of a combination of freedom for composing your own portfolio, but also some kind of general rules, and of course for wanting to achieve the degree. So a combination of freedom and boundaries, and that of course will depend on especially on the discipline where you're in, or the university, or the phase of your.
Oh, we just lose Christine. Christine, I think we've lost you. We'll come back to you.
I'm sure that there are means to advise. There's a lot that, yeah, there are still really lots of gaps in research concerning the PhD supervision. I mean, they're a crucial it's a crucial factor in PhD success, but it's kind of under-researched.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. Diane?
Yeah, I was going to make a related point, which is because I think some of the comments in the comment section had to do with the question of what's concurrent, how do you fit this alongside that kinds of questions. And I'm not able to answer those because I think really in a way no one can. But I just wanted to acknowledge as a feature of this conversation how much the pressures have really mounted, I think, certainly on the humanities side, which is the side I know best, for students to be publishing very early. And it might be an argument in favor of coursework that it gives them opportunities to work up things that can be standalone projects that could potentially evolve into journal articles. I've seen that happen, in some cases, and I think that's beneficial. But I think given, the realities of the job market, the PhD students that I've had in recent years are publishing almost from their first year. And they need to do that in order to be remotely competitive on the job market, because of course the things that you once did to get tenure, 6, 7 or so years post PhD are now the things that are required for you to get an interview for a kind of low-level lectureship. So we're very mindful of that and see the training of PhD students as very holistic. And unfortunately, there can't be.
Sorry, let me. Sorry, could we ask everybody who's not speaking to mute? Sorry, there we go. Go ahead, Diane.
I was more or less finished in any case, but just wanted to make that point that I think that the early professionalization and even the sort of the heightened expectations for PhD students and PhD candidates to publish their work very early fits into this conversation as well. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Yes, and leading on from that, the conversation that's developing, Marie wanting to talk about the interactions between supervisor and student and responsibilities and contributions. Marie, would you like to go ahead? And then Paul.
Yeah, and the reason I bring that up, especially I was thinking about it when Patrick was talking about time to degree and success. So in engineering and in many STEM fields, students are typically publishing with their advisors. And so there's a real motivation for advisors, supervisors, tend to call them advisors in the US, to move their students forward, to help their students get work out, because a student may be working on my research grant when we used to get research grants before the current crisis in the US. But, faculty want students to publish because they're going to be co-authored papers, and that's going to help the faculty member get tenured. When I was in English, much like Paul said, I published and I worked fairly independently from my supervisor. We were not working on joint projects. I was not being funded by her to do projects. And I think not just in terms of how we think about coursework, but how we think about time to degree and students' progress and the investment of the supervisor, the incentive for the supervisor to be engaged can be really different in different fields. And that can have a huge time to degree impact. And so if we're not taking that into account as well, that can be really crucial.
Indeed, indeed. I see another. Oh, sorry, Paul, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that for me, it's not a question of publishing or not publishing, one being right, one being wrong. But what's really important is that we're explicit about that with our PhD researchers from the beginning. We say what the deal is and we explain why the deal is what it is and how that works. And that's made really explicit. And the other thing for me that's really important as a PhD supervisor is I see my role as helping the student to write the contribution to knowledge they want to write, and so seeing that they're going to publish it gives me that freedom that my name's not associated. It's not what Paul Ashwin says in the field that matters in this particular case. It's what the student wants to contribute. And so I really like that aspect of it. I really like the fact that I see my role as helping the student to achieve their contribution rather than the students perhaps ventriloquizing my contribution. That's not what I'm interested in. But again, that speaks to Marie's point about different motivations for different supervisors. I'm suggesting other supervisors are motivated by ventriloquism, but more that it just works differently in different fields. And the crucial thing is that we're clear about that from the beginning of the process, rather than suddenly surprising students at the end that what they thought was going to happen doesn't happen.
Indeed, thank you. And if I might say, that's the role of supervisors and the expertise and training of supervisors is something very close to my heart and my interests. So I appreciate Christine's comments. Christine, maybe you'd like to comment a little more about the role of the supervisor and the issues that tend to arise between supervisors and students. Christine.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, there are various aspects of this relationship which are really precarious, and Marie already mentioned a few, like this publication goals, targets, kind of precarious interdependent relation. As I mentioned on the chat, I've done a round of interviews amongst PhD dropouts, and the far majority refer to their supervisor as being a major cause for having dropped out, while we also interviewed the supervisors, and they had a complete different picture of this. But yeah, it's a very precarious relationship. Part of it has been taken over by the graduate schools to a certain extent. I mean, the graduate schools are there to protect the PhDs against sometimes against the evil intentions of the supervisors. But of course, that doesn't always hold. Yeah, so it's a complex relation. You can also see that if it goes well, then generally goes very well. I mean, there are also many PhDs who completely rely on their supervisor, and they have a great bonding, and maybe, and especially also for a much longer time, even a lifetime, you could say. So it's complex, but if it goes wrong, it can go very wrong. And I also know from more a survey type of research that is like there's a substantial group, I would say 10-15%, who have a very bad relationship with their supervisors, and that's hard to that's really complex and hard to deal with. I'm sorry, I don't really have a solution.
No,
but
you raise it. I mean, that issue is a very common one, and we hear about it a great deal as well. Not that we necessarily have a one solution fits all for that, but it is certainly a complex issue.
Yeah, I've seen that sometimes it helps to have an additional supervisor, like to have three instead of two. It's kind of a mild solution, and sometimes you can. I mean, at least in the Netherlands, as PhD, you have lots of rights. You can change. You're not kind of locked to your supervisor. But it's really hard issue. Yeah, we also have these confidential persons. I'm not sure how you call them, but that's not
mentors. Yeah. Patrick, you've had your hand up for a minute or two. Would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. I just needed to add to what Christine is saying. I think that on the issue of publication, what Marie was saying earlier, if the student is joining the supervisor's project, then the supervisor has a case to be made, and the contribution then would be that if you look at guidelines on authorship, the work would be substantial also. They would be invested in it, and then you'd say that they can publish. But what we have in most countries, and particularly in Kenya, is that promotion is based on what we call publication points, right? And so there's just a quest, like a race for people to accumulate this, and you need lots of applications to be able to accumulate these publication points. And so there's increasingly what I see is a bit of selfishness, right, for people to even want to have their names in places or in manuscripts where they have very minimal contributions too. So there's a challenge there. Some is just the nature of our institutions or the nature of nationwide guidelines on promotions. Secondly, I would like to add to the idea of supervision. In places where there's no coursework, a student meets with a supervisor, it almost feels like going on a blind date, doesn't it, right? You're meeting them, you don't know enough about them. And sometimes things go terribly wrong, right? Sometimes they work out really well. And so I think that is one place where coursework can give students an opportunity to, gauge in terms of match between, can I work with so-and-so, Professor so-and-so, can I work with this other person? I like the way they approach issues, I like their demeanor, as opposed to getting in there, meeting this person, or they picked you on the grounds that your work fits with their research. And so when you are applying, you pick them, and then that is how the marriage is arranged, as it were. And sometimes it doesn't end well. So I think this is an area where coursework could help to give students a chance to be able to know who they are getting involved with, for the lack of a better phrase. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We also have in the chat some discussion about structure, if you like, within programs. And a little earlier, I mentioned, and Rod Walker has also just queried, the concept of what in this country we call a professional doctorate. And if I may just take the liberty of saying, I think we are going to have to change our definitions and our thinking around this as we incorporate coursework into our normal PhDs, because up until now we have had a definition which says that a professional doctorate is one in which there is credit-bearing coursework. And in some cases, the whole program is credit-bearing coursework. But I think we are going to be changing as we develop our concepts around all of this, so that I think we go back to that, what Paul and one or two others have termed a structured course, where we incorporate at least some time spent on courses and coursework for whatever its purpose, as opposed to what has, in the old-fashioned traditional way, been a completely research-driven process where the whole PhD has involved a research project. So I think we're still very much in, well, we always will be in transition. And then just to see also in the chat, Marie's comment about the fundamental question related to coursework is how it can help the supervisor, and the issue which then goes right back to the benefits to the supervisor of being a supervisor or an advisor, and what we need to do as supervisors changes. And I think that we move on to it. This is the topic for our next colloquium, I think, is how do we structure, or how do we design the role of a supervisor, which is changing all the time. Paul, I see your comment there. We use structured PhD to make it clear that it wasn't a taught doctorate. So here we have a spectrum, I guess, of the way in which a doctorate is composed. This is a very long comment, and I need to start at the beginning of it. Sue, would you like to verbalize your small rant about the system?
No, I just think that helping students to learn how to publish in order to disseminate their contribution to knowledge is a very, very valuable thing. But we just need to be careful we don't frame it in the way that our universities frame it, in the way that the rankings organization frame it, which is the publication is a commodity and you've got to get it to put it on your CV. And I just think that is killing the love of knowledge. Yeah, so I always tell my students, please don't publish. And I give them a whole lecture about why I do not want them to publish, because I cannot read everything that is written in my field. I cannot keep up. So for heaven's sake, don't add to it. And then I go on to say, if, however, you've got some contribution that you really think publication is the way to get out there, well, only then should you publish. And it's interesting to me that my students do all publish. So anyway, that's just my little rant.
So, colleagues, this has been a very rich discussion, and I think we are just about ready to wrap it up. And I think Sue has just summed it up in terms of a love of knowledge, which is a wonderful way of describing, I think, the motivation that many people feel when they embark on a doctoral study of whatever type it is. I see also the contributions and the discussion about the issues around teaching loads, and I think again we'll take note of that and take it forward in our next discussion. I would like to just confirm for everybody what we have in the chat and what has been commented on, all of the questions and the oral discussion, as well as what is written, is all being recorded, and we will document it. I'm making work here for Sue and Shiloh as well, but we will make a summary of this discussion, which then, of course, will be available. The recording will be available. So please don't feel that because we may not have actually asked you about about your question or your comment, that we have not taken note of it. And I think we'll go back to a drawing board for what we'll have in our next discussion points. We certainly will need to think again some more about what we mean in our national system of putting coursework into doctoral programs. Willem, I see your comments about that. We do need to talk about how we will structure it in our country, but this has been a fantastic discussion, very eye-opening for me, and I think for everybody, in terms of the very different approaches that are being made, and the different ways in which different programs, different disciplines, and interdisciplinary programs are developing. So perhaps let me conclude. I'll hand over to Sue in a moment, but let me just say thank you very much to our speakers for, I think, very far-sighted comments on what we are talking about in terms of coursework and doctoral programs. And thank you very much indeed for opening our eyes to new questions. Please do feel free to continue to communicate with us, me and Sue, or via Shiloh, about any other comments that you'd like to make. And please be assured that we will be inviting more discussion on some of these other topics as we go. I think we've learned a great deal now, and I think there's still a great deal more to be considered and to be learned. So thank you, everybody, and thank you very much to the audience. We had at one time about 165 people, so that I think that speaks to the relevance of the discussion that we've been having. So thank you very much, everybody, and Sue, over to you to close off.
Just to echo your thanks, Stephanie. I think we had 5 fantastic presentations that, my mind is buzzing with all the work that we have ahead of us, and really such useful insights from all of you. And my takeaway is the importance of building community and collaboration into our doctoral programs, and that coursework might be part of the vehicle for doing that. And also then something that was regularly mentioned, that we really need to take context into account. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Our different universities, different countries, different disciplines are all going to have an impact on how we end up implementing coursework, if indeed we do. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks to our speakers. Keep well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
This
you.
was
Bye.
lovely to
Everyone.
be here.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very enriching.